Sometimes the people we love most leave us the hardest choices. When a father's love becomes a legal trap, what lengths will a daughter go to protect everything he built? Miss Loretta Harlan sits in her empty schoolhouse, reading her father's will for the 100th time. The words haven't changed: marry within 1 year or lose everything. Her cousin waits like a vulture, ready to sell her land and close her school the moment the deadline passes. Most women would find a husband and fall in line. Loretta decides to find a man who wants nothing from her. When Asa Boone rides into Bellflower, bluffer, gentle giant with kind eyes and calloused hands, she makes him an offer that shocks them both. Marry me and I'll give you my fortune. But what happens when a marriage of convenience becomes inconveniently real? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the schoolhouse windows gold as Loretta Harlan folded the will with deliberate precision. Her father's careful handwriting had spelled out his intentions clearly enough: marry within 12 months, or forfeit the Harlan fortune to her cousin Vernon. What he hadn't spelled out was why. She traced the worn wooden desk where she'd taught 3 generations of Bellflower Bluff children to read and cipher. Her father had built this school with his own hands 40 years ago, back when the town was nothing but a trading post and big dreams. Now it stood as the heart of a community that had grown around his vision: the general store, the church, the modest homes of families who'd put down roots in this windswept corner of the territory. Vernon Castleberry had made his intentions clear the day after the funeral. Sell it all, cousin. Take the money and move to Denver. Live like a proper lady instead of playing schoolmom in this god-forsaken place. His pale eyes had swept the schoolroom with unconcealed disdain. These people can send their children to the county school 20 miles south. Progress, Loretta. That's what your father would have wanted. But Vernon hadn't known her father the way she had. Thomas Harlan had believed in building something that lasted, something that served others. He'd scraped together every dollar to send her east for teachers' training, not so she could abandon Bellflower Bluff, but so she could return and nurture it. The sound of wagon wheels on the dusty main street drew her to the window. A lone rider approached, leading a packhorse loaded with supplies. Even from a distance, she could see he was built like the mountains themselves: broad shoulders that seemed to carry the world without effort, hands that looked capable of gentling a spooked horse or raising a barn beam. Asa Boone had arrived 3 days ago, with little fanfare and fewer words. He'd taken a room at Mrs. Mackenzie's boarding house, paid a week in advance, and set about fixing things that needed fixing. The church bell that hadn't rung properly in 2 years now chimed clear and true. The sagging porch at the general store stood straight and sturdy. He asked for no payment, accepted meals when offered, and spoke only when spoken to. "Drifter," Mrs. Mackenzie had pronounced over Sunday dinner, "though a more polite drifter I've never met. Says yes ma'am and no ma'am like his mother taught him proper, but there's something in his eyes like he's seen more than a man ought to see." Loretta had noticed those eyes herself: dark brown, the color of rich soil after rain, with depths that suggested stories he'd never tell. When she'd passed him on the street, he'd touched his hat brim and murmured, "Miss Harlan," in a voice like distant thunder. No assumption of familiarity, no forward glances, just quiet respect. Now, watching him secure his horse with practiced efficiency, she found herself considering possibilities that would have seemed impossible a week ago. She needed a husband knot, a romantic entanglement, not a love match, but a legal necessity. Someone honorable enough to respect the terms of their arrangement and strong enough to withstand Vernon's inevitable challenges. The man working in the street below possessed both qualities in abundance, if her judgment served her correctly. She smoothed her dark blue dress and checked her reflection in the small mirror by the door. At 28, she'd long since abandoned the elaborate hairstyles and bright colors favored by younger women. Her auburn hair was pinned back in a practical style that stayed neat through long school days, and her clothing reflected her position as the town's teacher, respectable, modest, and built to last. The afternoon students wouldn't arrive for another hour. Time enough for a conversation that might change everything. The walk to the boarding house took her past the heart of the community her father had helped build. Old Henrik Johansson tended his garden behind the blacksmith shop, coaxing tomatoes and beans from soil that fought back. Young Mary Patterson swept the steps of her family's dry goods store while her baby napped in a basket nearby. These were her people, her responsibility. If she lost the inheritance, Vernon would sell to Eastern investors who saw only profit margins and shipping distances. Mrs. Mackenzie answered the door with flour-dusted hands and a welcoming smile. "Miss Harlan, what brings you by on such a fine afternoon?" "I was hoping to speak with Mr. Boone if he's available." The older woman's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained carefully neutral. "He's out back, fixing the rain barrel. Been at it for an hour now, though I told him it's been leaking for 3 years and I've gotten used to it." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Shall I fetch him?" "If you wouldn't mind." A few minutes later, Asa Boone appeared around the corner of the house, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and marked with old scars. He'd removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and a face that belonged to a man who'd learned early that life rarely offered easy choices. "Miss Harlan," he inclined his head respectfully, "Mrs. Mackenzie said you wanted to speak with me." Up close, she could see the details that distance had hidden. A small scar along his jaw, probably from a childhood accident. Callosed hands that spoke of years spent working with tools and rope and stubborn animals. Eyes that held intelligence and something else, wariness that suggested he'd learned to read people carefully before trusting them. "I have a proposition for you, Mr. Boone. A business proposition." His expression didn't change, but she caught a slight shift in his posture, a subtle straightening that suggested increased attention. "I'm listening. Perhaps we could walk while we talk. The conversation is rather private." He nodded and fell into step beside her as she led the way toward the edge of town. His presence was steadying somehow, like walking next to a mountain that had no intention of moving. They passed the last house and continued along the path that led to the small cemetery where her father rested beneath a simple granite stone. "This is where it started," she said, stopping before Thomas Harlan's grave. "My father was a practical man, Mr. Boone. He built this town with his hands and his heart, but he was also a man of his time. He believed a woman needed a husband's protection to survive in this world." Asa said nothing, but she sensed his attention like heat from a banked fire. "His will stipulates that I must marry within 1 year of his death, or forfeit his entire estate to my cousin Vernon Castleberry." She kept her voice steady, businesslike. "Vernon has made it clear he intends to sell everything, the land, the buildings, including the school. The people of Bellflower Bluff would lose their homes, their community, everything my father worked to create." Still, Asa remained silent, but his gaze had shifted from the headstone to her face. "I need a husband, Mr. Boone. Not a romantic attachment, not a traditional marriage, but a legal arrangement that satisfies the terms of the will and protects this community." She turned to face him fully. "In exchange, I'm prepared to offer you half of everything I inherit. Land, cattle, mining rights, cash holding sits worth more than most men see in a lifetime." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the prairie grass. When Asa finally spoke, his voice carried the same quiet authority she'd noticed before. "What makes you think I'd be interested in such an arrangement?" The question was fair, and she'd prepared for it. "You're a man of honor. I can see it in how you carry yourself, how you treat others. You're not from here, which means no complicated local allegiances. And you're clearly capable of taking care of yourself, which suggests you won't be easily intimidated by my cousin's attempts to interfere." "And what makes you think your cousin will try to interfere?" "Because Vernon Castleberry is a man who takes what he wants and destroys what he can't use. He'll challenge any marriage I make, look for legal loopholes, try to prove it's a fraud. I need someone strong enough to weather that storm." Asa studied her for another long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. "What exactly would you expect from this arrangement?" A wedding ceremony to satisfy the legal requirements. Your name on the appropriate documents. Your presence in Bellflower Bluff long enough to establish the validity of the marriage. She paused, then added, and your word that you won't try to control me or my decisions once the legal necessities are satisfied. And after that? After that, you'd be free to go wherever you choose, with more money than you could spend in several lifetimes. Or you could stay, if the town suits you. The choice would be entirely yours. He was quiet for so long she began to wonder if she'd misjudged him entirely. Perhaps he was the type of man who would be offended by such a direct proposition. Perhaps, I don't need your money, ma'am. The words hit her like cold water, but before she could respond, he continued, but I won't let you fight alone. 3 days after their conversation at the cemetery, Loretta found herself questioning every assumption she'd made about Asa Boone's answer. I won't let you fight alone could mean anything: partnership, pity, or simply the natural instinct of a decent man to help someone in trouble. She'd expected a clear yes or no, not a statement that left her wondering where she stood. The uncertainty gnawed at her as she prepared for the weekly town council meeting. As the largest landowner and primary benefactor of the school, she traditionally attended these gatherings, though her voice carried more weight in practice than it did in law. Tonight's agenda included a discussion of the proposed railroad spura project that could bring prosperity to Bellflower Bluff or destroy its character entirely, depending on who controlled the decisions. She was pinning her hat when Mrs. Patterson burst through the schoolhouse door without knocking, her face flushed with exertion and alarm. Miss Harlan, thank goodness you're still here. Vernon Castleberry's in town, and he's brought lawyers with him, 3 of them, all the way from Denver. They're setting up in the hotel parlor like they own the place. Loretta's hands stilled on her hatpin. Vernon hadn't been expected for another month. Did they say what they want? To review the situation, according to Mrs. Mackenzie. But Miss Harlan, Mary Patterson's voice dropped to a whisper, as if the walls themselves might betray her confidence. I heard one of them talking to the telegraph operator. They're asking questions about you and Mr. Boone, about whether you've been seen together, about his intentions. The implication hit like a physical blow. Vernon wasn't waiting for the year deadline. He was building a case to challenge any marriage she might make, gathering evidence to prove fraud or coercion. If he could demonstrate that her eventual marriage was a sham arrangement rather than a genuine union, he could contest the will's fulfillment in court. Where is Mr. Boone now? That's the other thing. He left this morning with his horse and pack, didn't say where he was going or when he'd be back. Mrs. Mackenzie thinks he might have moved on entirely. The words struck deeper than they should have. Loretta had built her proposal on the assumption that Asa was a man of his word. But what if she'd misread him entirely? What if "I won't let you fight alone" had been nothing more than a polite way of declining her offer? She forced her expression to remain calm, even as her mind raced through possibilities. Without Asa, she'd have to find another candidate for her marriage arrangement, and with Vernon's lawyers already investigating, any new relationship would be subject to intense scrutiny. Worse, word of her proposition might spread, making it impossible to find any respectable man willing to enter such an agreement. Mary, I need you to do something for me. Go to the telegraph office and send a message to Judge Morrison in the county seat. Tell him I need to speak with him about my father's will at his earliest convenience. The younger woman nodded eagerly, clearly relieved to have a concrete task. And what about the town meeting tonight? I'll be there. Loretta straightened her shoulders with deliberate resolve. If Vernon wants to make this a public battle, he'll discover that his cousin is not as easily intimidated as he assumes. The hotel parlor buzzed with an energy that felt foreign to Bellflower Bluff's usual rhythms. 3 men in expensive suits occupied the best table, their papers spread across the surface like a battle plan. Vernon Castleberry held court at their center, his pale hair slicked back and his manner radiating the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. He rose when Loretta entered, offering a smile that never reached his eyes. "Cousin Loretta, how lovely you look. I hope you don't mind that I arrived a bit early." I wanted to ensure everything was in order before we proceed with the necessary arrangements. Arrangements? She kept her voice level, aware that every person in the room was listening. I wasn't aware we had any arrangements to make. Oh, but we do. Vernon's tone carried the patronizing warmth of a man explaining simple concepts to a child. I've been giving considerable thought to your situation, and I've realized how unfair it was of Uncle Thomas to burden you with such impossible expectations. Marriage within a year, what was he thinking? A woman of your education and refinement shouldn't be forced into such desperate measures. One of the lawyers, a thin man with wire spectacles, cleared his throat. Mr. Castlebury has asked us to review the will's language for potential challenges. There are several interpretative issues that might warrant court consideration. Such as... Vernon leaned forward with the eagerness of a cat approaching a cornered mouse. The definition of marriage, for instance. Surely Uncle Thomas intended a genuine union, not some legal fiction designed to circumvent his wishes. A marriage of convenience, entered into solely for financial gain, could hardly satisfy the spirit of his requirements. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Vernon was announcing his strategy in public, making it clear that any marriage she contracted would face immediate legal challenge. Worse, he was doing it in front of witnesses who would remember every word. I see. Loretta's voice carried the crisp authority she used with misbehaving students. And what alternative do you propose? A reasonable compromise. You retain a modest portion of the estate enough to live comfortably, while I assume responsibility for the larger holdings and their management. The burden of maintaining all that property, making investment decisions, dealing with business matter. Surely, you'd prefer to leave such complications to someone better equipped to handle them. Someone like you. Precisely. It's what Uncle Thomas would have wanted if he'd truly understood the situation he was creating. The conversation had drawn a small crowd of townspeople, ostensibly there for the council meeting but clearly more interested in this unexpected drama. Loretta could see the worry in their faces, the understanding that their futures hung in the balance of this exchange. Before she could respond, the hotel door opened with enough force to rattle the windows. Asa Boone filled the doorway, his presence transforming the room's dynamics as surely as a thunderstorm changes the sky. He'd been riding hard dust, covered his clothes and perspiration, darkened his shirt butt. His manner held the controlled intensity of a man who'd made an important decision. His dark eyes swept the room, taking in the lawyers, Vernon's confident posture, and Loretta's carefully composed expression. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that commanded attention. "Excuse me for interrupting. I believe there's been some confusion about Miss Harlan's situation." Vernon's smile faltered slightly. "And you are?" "Asa Boone, Miss Harlan's intended husband." The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread through the assembled crowd. Loretta felt something shift inside her chest relief, gratitude, and something else she couldn't quite name. "Intended husband," Vernon's voice sharpened. "Loretta, you said nothing about an engagement." "Because there wasn't one to announce." Asa stepped fully into the room, his calm presence somehow making the space feel smaller. "Until now." He moved to Loretta's side with the easy confidence of a man claiming his rightful place. When he offered her his arm, she took it without hesitation, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Miss Harlan has done me the honor of accepting my proposal," Asa continued, his gaze fixed on Vernon. "We plan to be married within the month." One of the lawyers leaned forward eagerly. "Might I ask about the circumstances of this engagement? How long have you known Miss Harlan? What are your intentions regarding her property?" Asa's expression didn't change, but something in his posture suggested steel beneath the surface calm. "My intentions are to marry the woman I love and to protect what's hers. As for the rest, I don't see how that concerns anyone but Miss Harlan and myself." "Love?" Vernon's laugh held no warmth. "How convenient. And what exactly do you do for a living, Mr. Boone? What qualifications do you have for managing a substantial estate?" "I work with my hands. I fix what's broken and build what's needed. As for qualifications, Asa's eyes met Vernon's directly. I've never taken what didn't belong to me, and I've never broken a promise to a woman who trusted me with her future. The implied contrast with Vernon's character wasn't lost on anyone in the room. A murmur of approval rippled through the assembled townspeople, and Loretta felt a surge of admiration for the man beside her. He was fighting her battle with weapons. Vernon hadn't expected simple honesty and unshakable integrity. But Vernon wasn't finished. How romantic. And when exactly did this whirlwind courtship begin? Because according to my sources, you've been in town less than a week. Sometimes a week is enough, Asa replied evenly. When you meet the right person, you know. Or when you need to secure a substantial inheritance before a deadline expires. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Loretta felt Asa's arm tense beneath her hand, but his voice remained controlled. Mr. Castleberry, I think you've said enough. Have I? Because it seems to me that a man who arrives in town with nothing but the clothes on his back and immediately proposes to the wealthiest woman in the county might have motives worth questioning. This time, Asa's response carried an edge that made several people step back. And it seems to me that a man who shows up with lawyers to steal his cousin's inheritance might want to be careful about questioning other people's motives. The two men faced each other across the room, and Loretta could feel the tension crackling between them like heat lightning. This was the moment she'd feared, the confrontation that would determine whether her plan had any chance of success. Then Asa did something that surprised everyone. He smiled, not the cold expression of a man preparing for battle, but the warm, genuine smile of someone remembering something precious. "Miss Harlan," he said, turning to face her fully, "would you do me the honor of a dance?" There was no music, no dance floor, nothing but the cramped hotel parlor and a room full of watching eyes. But Loretta understood what he was offering, a moment of grace in the middle of their war, a declaration that their relationship transcended the legal and financial complications swirling around them. She placed her hand in his. "I would be delighted." As they moved together in the small space, swaying to music only they could hear, the room around them seemed to fade. For those few moments, they weren't actors in a legal drama or chess pieces in Vernon's game. They were simply a man and a woman who had found each other in a difficult world and chosen to face whatever came next together. When the dance ended, Vernon's confident smile had disappeared entirely. The morning after the confrontation at the hotel, Loretta woke to find a small wildflower bouquet on her schoolhouse doorstep. No note, no signature, just prairie blooms tied with a piece of leather cord, the kind a man might use to repair tack or secure a pack. The gesture was so simple and unexpected that she found herself smiling despite the weight of everything that lay ahead. Inside, she discovered that someone had repaired the loose floorboard that had troubled her for months and oiled the hinges on the windows that always stuck. Again, no note, but the work bore the hallmarks of careful craftsmanship she was beginning to associate with Asa Boone. She was still examining the flowers when Mrs. Mackenzie arrived with a basket of warm biscuits and an expression of barely contained excitement. "Miss Harlan, I hope you'll forgive the early hour, but I simply had to tell someone, or I'd burst, that Mr. Boone of your she's been up since before dawn, working on something behind the boarding house. Won't say what, just asks for hammer and nails and measures everything twice." She set the basket down with the reverence due a peace offering. "And the way he spoke about you last night, well, I may be getting on in years, but I know love when I see it." Loretta felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Mrs. Mackenzie, I think you may be reading more into the situation than—" "Nonsense." The man looked ready to take on Vernon Castleberry with his bare hands when that fancy lawyer started asking his pointed questions. "That's not the behavior of someone entering a business arrangement." The older woman's observation struck closer to home than Loretta cared to admit. There had been something in Asa's manner last night that went beyond simple protective instincts. When he'd offered his arm, when he'd asked her to dance, the look in his eyes had suggested emotions that had nothing to do with legal necessities. But that was dangerous thinking. Their arrangement worked precisely because it was based on mutual benefit rather than romantic entanglement. If she started believing in fairy tales, she'd lose the clear-headed perspective that had gotten her this far. "Whatever his motivations," she said carefully, "I'm grateful for his support. Vernon's challenge will require us to present a united front." Mrs. Mackenzie's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled by the diplomatic language, but she simply nodded and began unpacking her basket. "Speaking of united fronts, you should know that the whole town's talking about last night. Most folks are saying it's about time someone stood up to Vernon Castleberry, and they're pleased as punch that you found yourself a man with enough backbone to do it. And the others? Well, there's always a few who'd rather see change than fight for what they have. Mrs. Weatherby thinks you should take Vernon's offer and move to Denver where you'd be more comfortable. But then Mrs. Weatherby's been angling to get her daughter-in-law the teaching position ever since her son married that flighty Peterson girl. The politics of small-town life were as complex as any legal maneuvering, and Loretta had learned long ago to navigate them carefully. Still, it was reassuring to know that most of her neighbors supported her efforts to preserve their community. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find young Timothy Patterson, Mary's eldest boy, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "Miss Harlan, ma'am. Boone asked me to give you this." He thrust a folded paper into her hands and immediately took a step back, as if afraid she might explode like an unstable piece of chemical apparatus. The note was written in careful script that suggested education despite calloused hands. "Miss Harlan, would you be available for a ride this afternoon? There are matters we should discuss, away from curious ears. I'll wait by the oak tree at the north end of town at 2 o'clock if convenient. A. Boone." She looked up to find Timothy still waiting anxiously. "Tell Mr. Boone that 2 o'clock will be fine." The boy nodded enthusiastically and raced off as if he'd been released from a particularly difficult lesson. Mrs. Mackenzie, who had been listening with unabashed interest, clucked approvingly. "A sensible man, wanting to discuss things properly before you make any firm announcements. Your father would have liked him, I think." Perhaps. Thomas Harlan had valued practical wisdom over social polish, and Asa certainly possessed the former. But her father had also been a romantic at heart witness, his courtship of her mother, which had involved serenades and poetry, despite his reputation as a hard-headed businessman. Would he have approved of his daughter's calculated approach to marriage? The question troubled her throughout the morning as she prepared lessons for the afternoon's classes. When 2 o'clock arrived, she found herself changing clothes twice before settling on a practical riding dress in deep green wool. Not because she wanted to impress Asa Boone, she told herself, but because appearances mattered when establishing the credibility of their engagement. He was waiting beneath the massive oak that marked the town's northern boundary, holding the reins of 2 horses she's own, steady gelding, and a smaller mare she recognized as belonging to the livery stable. When he saw her approaching, he removed his hat and offered a smile that seemed genuinely pleased rather than merely polite. "Miss Harlan, thank you for agreeing to ride with me. Thank you for arranging the horse. I haven't ridden in longer than I care to admit. Daisy's gentle as a lamb and steady as a rocking chair. She'll take good care of you." His easy confidence with the animals reminded her that despite his mysterious past, he was clearly experienced with ranch work. As he helped her into the side saddle, his hands were firm and sure, and she caught the scent of leather and soap and something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken despite her rational intentions. They rode in comfortable silence until the town disappeared behind a rise in the prairie. Out here, with nothing but grassland stretching to the horizon, the weight of social expectations seemed to lift from her shoulders. This was the landscape her father had fallen in love with, vast, honest, unforgiving to the weak, but generous to those who understood its rhythms. Asa finally broke the silence when they reached a small creek lined with cottonwoods. "We need to talk about what happens next." She guided Daisy to a stop beside a fallen log that would serve as a mounting block when they were ready to return. "I assume you mean Vernon's challenge to our engagement." Among other things, he dismounted and came around to help her down, his hands spanning her waist as he lifted her from the saddle. For a moment they stood close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his chest. Then he stepped back with what seemed like deliberate control. Those lawyers aren't just asking questions for curiosity's sake. They're building a case to prove fraud, and they're smart enough to know what kind of evidence they'll need. Loretta settled on the log, grateful for the chance to organize her thoughts. What kind of evidence? Witnesses who can testify that our courtship was genuine. Evidence that we spent time together, that there was real affection between us. He leaned against a tree trunk, his posture relaxed, but his expression serious. They'll want to prove that I'm nothing but a fortune hunter who took advantage of your desperate situation. And how do we counter that? By making sure there are plenty of witnesses to our courtship, public displays of affection, private moments that accidentally become public, the kind of behavior people expect from a couple in love. The word love hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Loretta found herself studying his face, looking for some sign of how he truly felt about their arrangement. His expression remained carefully neutral, but she caught something in his eyes, warmth that suggested the pretense might not be entirely pretense. You're talking about an elaborate performance. I'm talking about survival. Vernon's not going to give up easily, and those lawyers didn't come cheap. They'll interview everyone in town, looking for inconsistencies in our story, evidence that our engagement is purely mercenary. And what story would you suggest we tell? Asa was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the water flowing past their feet. When he spoke, his voice carried a thoughtful quality that suggested he'd been considering this question for some time. The truth, mostly. I came to town with nothing but what I could carry. You're a woman who's built her life around serving others, who's facing the loss of everything that matters to her. We met, we talked, we discovered we understood each other. He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. The only lie would be in the timing. The timing. Letting people believe we fell in love at first sight, instead of admitting that we started with mutual respect and practical considerations. The admission that their arrangement was based on respect rather than pure calculation warmed something in her chest that she hadn't realized was cold. And you think that will be enough to convince a judge? I think it will be enough to convince the people who matter, your neighbors, the folks who've known you all your life. If they believe in us, their testimony will carry more weight than anything Vernon's lawyers can manufacture. She studied his profile as he watched the water, noting the strong line of his jaw and the way the afternoon light brought out the silver threads in his dark hair. This was a man who'd lived long enough to understand that life rarely offered perfect solutions, only choices between different kinds of compromise. There's something else we need to discuss, she said finally. The practical arrangements of our marriage, such as where we'll live, how we'll present ourselves as a couple, what happens after Vernon's challenge is resolved. She paused, then added with careful neutrality, the physical aspects of our arrangement. Color rose in his cheeks, but his voice remained steady. I assumed we'd maintain separate bedrooms. I'm not the kind of man who takes what isn't freely given. The relief she felt was matched by something that might have been disappointment, though she wasn't prepared to examine that feeling too closely. And after the legal requirements are satisfied, that would be up to you. If you want me to leave, I'll leave. If you want me to stay in Bellflower Bluff but maintain our distance, I can respect that too. And if I wanted something else? The question slipped out before she could stop it, surprising them both. Asa turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. Miss Harlan Loretta, need you to understand something. I may have agreed to this arrangement for practical reasons, but my feelings aren't practical at all. Her heart stuttered against her ribs. What do you mean? I mean that pretending to care for you isn't going to be the hardest part of this charade. The hardest part is going to be pretending it's only pretense. The silence that followed Asa's admission stretched between them like a held breath. Loretta found herself studying the way the cottonwood leaves caught the afternoon light, anything to avoid the intensity in his dark eyes. His words had shifted something fundamental in the space between them, transforming their practical arrangement into something far more complicated. "Asa," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to navigate this new territory. "You don't have to say anything," he said quietly. "I just needed you to know where I stand before we start this performance. It won't be acting on my part." The honesty in his voice made her chest tight. She'd spent so much energy constructing a rational solution to her inheritance problem that she hadn't allowed herself to consider what it might mean to bind herself to a man who affected her more than she cared to admit. "We should head back," she said finally. "People will start to notice if we're gone too long." He nodded and moved to help her mount, his hands careful and impersonal, despite the intimacy of their conversation. As they rode back toward town, Loretta found herself stealing glances at his profile, trying to reconcile the quiet man beside her with the intensity of feeling he'd just revealed. Bellflower Bluff came into view as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the dusty main street in shades of gold and amber. As they approached the livery stable, Loretta noticed an unusual amount of activity around the hotel. Several unfamiliar horses stood tied to the hitching post, and she could see men in city clothes moving about with purposeful energy. "More lawyers?" she asked. Asa's expression darkened. "Or something worse?" They soon discovered it was indeed something worse. Vernon had brought reinforcements, not just legal counsel, but investigators who'd begun interviewing townspeople about Loretta's relationship with Asa. The questions were pointed and invasive. How long had they known each other? Had anyone witnessed romantic behavior between them? What were Mr. Boone's financial circumstances before his arrival in town? Mrs. Patterson met them at the livery with obvious distress. "Miss Harlan, they've been asking everyone the most inappropriate questions. Mrs. Weatherby told them she'd never seen you and Mr. Boone together before yesterday, and that Peterson woman practically drew them a diagram of your father's property holdings." Loretta felt her carefully constructed plans beginning to crumble. If Vernon's investigators could establish that her relationship with Asa was entirely recent, they'd have strong grounds for challenging the marriage as fraudulent. "What did you tell them?" Asa asked. "The truth, that you've been fixing things around town, and that Miss Harlan's always been friendly to newcomers." "But I don't think it was what they wanted to hear." Mary's expression brightened slightly. "Mrs. Mackenzie, on the other hand, gave them quite an earful about how obvious it was that you two were smitten with each other from the moment you met." Despite everything, Loretta found herself smiling. "Trust Mrs. Mackenzie to embroider the truth in service of a good cause." "There's something else," Mary continued, lowering her voice. "They're asking about your father's will, about whether anyone heard him express doubts about the marriage requirement. And they've requested access to his personal papers." This was more serious than Loretta had anticipated. If Vernon's team could find evidence that her father had second thoughts about his stipulation, or if they could prove he'd written it under duress or diminished capacity, they might be able to invalidate the entire requirement. "His papers are in his study at the house," she said. "Vernon doesn't have legal access to them yet. But he will if he can convince a judge to issue a court order," Asa observed. "How long would that take?" "Days, maybe a week if we're lucky." They parted company at the stable, agreeing to meet the following morning to plan their response. As Loretta walked home through the gathering dusk, she found herself noticing details she'd taken for granted: the way lamplight spilled from kitchen windows, the sound of children playing in side yards, the comfortable rhythms of a community at peace with itself, all of it threatened by Vernon's ambition and her own miscalculations. The house felt enormous and empty when she let herself in through the front door. Her father's presence still lingered in the placement of furniture, the books on his desk, the pipe tobacco scent that clung to his favorite chair. She'd avoided his study since the funeral, but tonight she forced herself to enter the room where he'd written the will that was causing so much trouble. His desk stood exactly as he'd left it, papers sorted into neat piles, his fountain pen placed precisely parallel to the edge of the blotter. This had been his sanctuary, the place where he'd made the decisions that shaped not just his own life, but the lives of everyone in Bellflower Bluff. She was sorting through correspondence when she found the letter, a single sheet, in her father's careful handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before his death. It was addressed to her but had apparently never been sent, perhaps because his illness had worsened too quickly. My dearest Loretta, by the time you read this, you'll have discovered the terms of my will and probably cursed my name for the burden I've placed on you. I want you to understand that the marriage requirement wasn't born of old-fashioned notions about women needing male protection. It came from something far more practical, my knowledge of Vernon's character and my fear of what he would do if given free rein over our family's holdings. You're stronger than any man I've ever known, including myself. But strength without allies is vulnerability, and Vernon will bring allies of his own when the time comes. I pray you'll find someone worthy of standing beside you in the fight ahead. Not someone to take care of you, but someone to fight alongside you. The marriage requirement can be satisfied in whatever way brings you happiness and security. I trust your judgment more than any legal language. All my love, your devoted father. Tears blurred her vision as she folded the letter carefully. Her father had understood exactly what she was facing and had tried to give her the tools to handle it. The marriage stipulation wasn't a trap, it was a gift, an opportunity to find the ally she'd need to preserve everything they'd built together. A soft knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. She found Asa standing on the porch, hat in hand, his expression uncertain. "I'm sorry to disturb you so late, but I wanted to make sure you were all right. Today's been difficult, and I know you're facing this mostly alone." "Not entirely alone," she said, stepping back to invite him in. "Would you like some coffee? There's something I need to show you." They sat in her father's study while she read him the letter, watching his expression change as he absorbed the implications. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "He sounds like a wise man." He was, and he was right about Vernon. She folded the letter and placed it in her desk drawer. "This doesn't solve our immediate problem, but it confirms that we're doing what he intended." "There's something else we need to consider," Asa said. "Those investigators aren't just gathering evidence against us. They're also trying to determine exactly what they're fighting for. If Vernon understands the full scope of your father's holdings, he might be willing to go further than we anticipated." "What do you mean?" "I mean that desperate men do desperate things. If Vernon realizes he's fighting for a fortune rather than just a comfortable inheritance, he might not limit himself to legal challenges." The implication sent a chill down her spine. "You think he'd try to harm us physically?" "I think he'd try whatever he thought he could get away with. And in a place this isolated, with friendly law enforcement, a lot could be made to look like accidents." The possibility hadn't occurred to her, but now that Asa had raised it, she could see how vulnerable they were. Vernon had resources, connections, and apparently few scruples about how he achieved his goals. "So what do you suggest?" "We accelerate our timeline. Instead of a month-long courtship, we get married within the week. It doesn't give Vernon much time to build his legal case, and it puts us in a stronger position if he tries anything more direct." "A week?" The thought made her stomach flutter with something that might have been nerves or anticipation. "That's not much time to plan a wedding." "We don't need an elaborate ceremony. We need a legal marriage with enough witnesses to establish its validity." She studied his face in the lamplight, looking for some sign of how he truly felt about binding himself to her so quickly. His expression was calm, but she was beginning to recognize the subtle signs of deeper emotion, the slight tension around his eyes, the careful stillness of his hands. "Asa, are you sure about this? Once we're married, there's no going back without social consequences for both of us." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The conviction in his voice made her heart race. "Then we should start planning. We'll need to speak with Reverend Harrison tomorrow, arrange for witnesses, prepare the legal documents." "Loretta." Something in his tone made her look up. He was leaning forward slightly, his dark eyes intent on her face. "Before we go any further, I need to ask you something. Are you sure you want me as your husband, not just as a solution to your inheritance problem, but as the man who'll share your name and your life?" The question hung between them, honest and vulnerable, in a way that made her throat tighten. She could see the uncertainty beneath his calm exterior, the fear that she saw him only as a convenient tool rather than a person worthy of consideration in his own right. "Yes," she said quietly, "I want you as my husband." The smile that transformed his face was worth every risk they were about to take. The next 3 days passed in a blur of careful orchestration and barely controlled chaos. Loretta discovered that planning a wedding under normal circumstances was complicated enough, but planning one while maintaining the illusion of a romantic courtship under the watchful eyes of Vernon's investigators required skills she'd never imagined needing. Every public interaction with Asa had to appear natural while serving their strategic purposes. They took morning walks that happened to pass the hotel, where Vernon's men could observe them. They shared lunch at the cafe, while discussing mundane topics in voices just loud enough for nearby tables to overhear fragments of conversation about their plans for the future. Most importantly, they practiced the subtle intimacies that marked genuine couples, the way he helped her navigate uneven sidewalks, how she adjusted his collar when the wind disturbed it, the shared glances that suggested private understanding. The performance should have felt artificial, but increasingly it didn't. When Asa took her arm during their evening stroll, the warmth of his touch seemed to radiate through her entire body. When she caught him watching her during Sunday service, the intensity in his dark eyes made her forget they had an audience at all. Mrs. Mackenzie appointed herself chief coordinator of the wedding preparations, throwing herself into the project with the enthusiasm of a general planning a military campaign. "A week's notice is scandalous," she declared while measuring Loretta for alterations to her mother's wedding dress. "But love doesn't wait for convenience. And that man of yours looks ready to marry you tomorrow if you'd let him." The dress itself became an unexpected source of emotion. Loretta's mother had worn it in 1845, a creation of ivory silk and delicate lace that had been carefully preserved in cedar and lavender. As Mrs. Mackenzie pinned and adjusted the fabric to accommodate Loretta's slightly fuller figure, memories surfaced of watching her parents together, the way her father's face had lit up whenever her mother entered a room, the quiet conversations they'd shared over morning coffee, the gentle teasing that had marked 40 years of partnership. "Your mother would be so pleased," Mrs. Mackenzie murmured around a mouthful of pins. "She always worried that you'd become so independent you'd forget to let someone love you." The comment struck unexpectedly deep. Had she become so focused on self-sufficiency that she'd closed herself off to the possibility of genuine partnership? The question became more pressing as she watched Asa through the window, working with Mr. Patterson to repair the church steps that had been sagging for months. His easy competence with tools and his patient way of explaining techniques to young Timothy suggested a man who found satisfaction in building rather than taking, in strengthening rather than controlling. On Wednesday evening, 3 days before the planned ceremony, Reverend Harrison visited to discuss the service details. A gentleman in his 60s who'd known Loretta since childhood, he'd agreed to perform the ceremony despite the short notice, though his manner suggested some concern about the haste. "Marriage is a sacred commitment," he said, settling into her father's chair with the careful movements of arthritis. "I want to be certain you've both considered the full implications of what you're undertaking." Asa, who'd been invited to join the conversation, met the minister's concerned gaze directly. "Reverend, I understand your concerns about the timing, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life than I am about my feelings for Loretta." "And what are those feelings, son?" The question hung in the air with the weight of examination. Loretta found herself holding her breath, waiting for Asa's response. "Love," he said simply. "Respect. A desire to build something lasting with a woman who shares my values and my vision for the future." "And you, Loretta, are you prepared to promise before God and this community to honor and cherish this man?" She looked at Asa, taking in the quiet strength of his posture, the honesty in his dark eyes, the careful way he held himself as if afraid to presume too much. Whatever had started as a business arrangement had evolved into something far more complex and precious. "Yes," she said, "I am." Reverend Harrison studied them both for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. We'll have the ceremony Saturday afternoon. Simple vows, traditional service, with the understanding that marriage requires daily choices to honor your commitment." After the minister left, Loretta and Asa found themselves alone in the gathering twilight, the weight of approaching finality settling around them like a familiar blanket. "Are you having second thoughts?" she asked. "No. Are you?" "No, but I am wondering what happens after Saturday, once we're legally married. How do we—" She paused, searching for the right words. "How do we navigate being husband and wife when we've never been courting couple?" Asa was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I suppose we learn as we go, take things one day at a time and see what develops naturally. And if nothing develops naturally, then we'll have what we started, with mutual respect and a shared purpose. That's more than many couples begin with." His practical response should have been reassuring, but instead it left her feeling oddly disappointed. Was she beginning to hope for more than their original agreement had promised? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the street. Through the window they could see one of Vernon's investigators arguing with Mr. Johansson, the elderly blacksmith. The heated exchange drew a small crowd, including Vernon himself, who emerged from the hotel with the confident stride of a man approaching victory. "Miss Harlan," Vernon called as he noticed them watching from the porch. "How convenient. I was hoping to speak with you." Asa stepped closer to her side, his presence solid and reassuring. "What do you want, Castleberry?" "To offer my cousin one final opportunity to reconsider this hasty marriage." Vernon's smile held no warmth. "You see, my investigators have been quite thorough in their research. They've discovered some interesting facts about Mr. Boone's background that might concern a woman about to entrust her future to his care." Loretta felt Asa tense beside her, but his voice remained level. "Such as the fact that Asa Boone died in a mining accident in Colorado 3 years ago, which raises the fascinating question of exactly who you are and what you're really after." The words hit like a physical blow. Loretta turned to look at Asa, searching his face for some sign that Vernon was lying, that this was just another legal maneuver designed to discredit their relationship. But the color had drained from Asa's features, and his hands had clenched into fists at his sides. "Well?" Vernon pressed, sensing advantage. "Care to explain how a dead man managed to court my cousin, or shall we discuss what other lies you've told her?" The watching crowd pressed closer, their faces reflecting curiosity and growing suspicion. Loretta could feel their carefully constructed narrative crumbling around them, could see the doubt beginning to replace the support they'd worked so hard to build. But before anyone could respond, Mrs. Mackenzie pushed through the crowd with the determination of a woman defending her family. "Vernon Castleberry, you ought to be ashamed of yourself, hiring strangers to dig up gossip and spread lies about decent people. Anyone with eyes can see that Mr. Boone is exactly who he claims to be, good man, who loves Loretta and wants to protect what her father built." "Mrs. Mackenzie, I understand your loyalty to Miss Harlan, but facts are facts. The man she plans to marry is using a false name, which raises serious questions about his motives and his past." Asa finally spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had marked him from the beginning. "My name is Asa Boone. I've never claimed otherwise." "But you're not the Asa Boone who died in Colorado." "No, I'm not." "Then who are you?" The question hung in the evening air like smoke from a doused fire. Loretta found herself looking at the man she'd agreed to marry, suddenly uncertain whether she knew him at all. Had everything between them been built on lies? Was Vernon right about his motives? When Asa met her eyes, she saw pain there, and regret, but also a steady honesty that suggested whatever truth he was hiding, it wasn't the calculated deception Vernon wanted everyone to believe. "My name is Asa Boone," he repeated, "and everything I've told you about my feelings for Loretta is true. The rest the details about my past are mine to share or keep as I choose." It wasn't a denial, but it wasn't the confession Vernon had been hoping for either. The crowd murmured uncertainly, clearly torn between their growing affection for Asa and their concern about the accusations against him. Vernon's expression darkened. "I'm afraid that's not acceptable. If you won't explain yourself voluntarily, perhaps the county sheriff will be more persuasive." "On what grounds?" Loretta demanded, finding her voice at last. "Using a common name isn't a crime, and you have no evidence of any wrongdoing beyond your own suspicious nature. I have evidence that your fiancé is not who he claims to be. That's grounds enough for investigation." The standoff stretched taut between them, drawing the entire town into their private battle. Loretta could feel the weight of watching eyes, the pressure of decisions that would affect not just her own future, but the future of everyone who called Bellflower Bluff home. Finally, Asa stepped forward, his decision made. "There's something I need to tell all of you about who I really am and why I came here." The silence that followed Asa's announcement stretched like a held breath across the assembled crowd. Loretta felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the man she'd agreed to marry prepare to reveal whatever truth he'd been carrying. His face had gone pale, but his posture remained steady, as if he'd finally decided to lay down a burden he'd been carrying too long. "My real name is Asa Boone," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "But I wasn't born with it. I took it from a good man who died saving my life 3 years ago in a Colorado mining camp." Vernon's expression sharpened with predatory interest. "So you admit to assuming a false identity?" "I admit to honoring a dead friend by carrying his name forward." Asa's dark eyes swept the crowd, meeting their curious gazes without flinching. "The man your investigators found records for was Asa Boone of Denvera mining engineer, a decent man, someone who tried to help others when he could. When a tunnel collapsed and trapped 6 of us underground, he used his knowledge to find a way out. He got 5 of us to safety before the whole section came down on him." Mrs. Mackenzie pressed a hand to her heart. "Lord have mercy. I was dying when they pulled me out, broken ribs, damaged lungs, more blood outside my body than in it. Asa had given me his water, his food, his coat to keep me warm. When the rescue team found his body, they found a letter in his pocket letter to a woman named Sarah, telling her he loved her and asking her to forgive him for not coming home." Asa paused, his gaze finding Loretta's face in the crowd. "I spent 2 months in a hospital bed, thinking about that letter and about the man who died so I could live. When I was finally strong enough to travel, I went to find Sarah. She'd moved away months earlier, married someone else. The house where Asa had lived was empty. His family was all gone, parents dead, no siblings. It was like he'd never existed at all." "So you decided to steal his identity?" Vernon pressed. "I decided to make sure someone remembered him." Asa's voice carried a quiet intensity that made several people in the crowd nod with understanding. "The name I was born with belonged to a man who'd made more enemies than friends, who'd hurt more people than he'd helped. Asa Boone was a name that belonged to someone worth remembering." Loretta felt tears prick her eyes as she began to understand the weight he'd been carrying. "What was your birth name?" Asa met her gaze directly, his expression both vulnerable and resolute. "Jacob Maddox." The name meant nothing to her, but clearly it meant something to one of Vernon's investigators, who leaned forward with sudden interest. "Jacob Maddox of Kansas." Among other places, the same Jacob Maddox who worked for the Pinkerton Agency, who was involved in the labor disputes in the mining camps. Asa's jaw tightened. "I worked for Pinkerton, yes, among other things." Vernon's smile turned triumphant. "Well, well, it seems my cousin is planning to marry not just a man with a false identity, but a hired gun, a man whose profession was violence." The words hit the crowd like a cold wind. Loretta could see doubt flowering in faces that had been friendly just moments before. A Pinkerton agenta man paid to break strikes and intimidate workers was not the kind of person the working families of Bellflower Bluff would welcome with open arms. "Is it true?" old Henrik Johansson asked, his weathered face troubled. "Were you one of those men who came to break honest workers, trying to feed their families?" Asa was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much truth he was prepared to reveal. When he spoke, His voice carried the weight of old regrets. I was. For 5 years, I took Pinkerton's money and did what they told me to do. I told myself I was keeping the peace, maintaining order. But the truth is, I was helping rich men stay rich by keeping poor men desperate. And now you've come here to take advantage of another desperate situation, Vernon added smoothly. How convenient that you found a wealthy woman whose inheritance problems require exactly the kind of solution a man in your profession might provide. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Loretta could see the logic of Vernon's argument taking hold in the watching faces. Why would a former Pinkerton agent, a man trained in deception and violence, happen to arrive in their town at exactly the moment she needed a husband? What were the odds that his feelings for her were genuine rather than calculated? But even as doubt crept through the crowd, Loretta found herself studying Ace's face and remembering the man she'd come to know, the gentle way he'd repaired things around town without being asked. His patience with Timothy Patterson as the boy learned to handle tools, the way he'd looked at her when he'd said their relationship wouldn't be acting on his part. "Why did you leave Pinkerton?" she asked quietly. Ace's expression softened slightly as he looked at her. "Because I met a man named Asa Boone, who showed me what it meant to care more about other people's welfare than your own survival. Because I realized that the person I'd become wasn't someone I could live with anymore." "Pretty words," Vernon said dismissively, "but words are cheap, and reformed killers are still killers. Are you really willing to trust your future to a man whose past profession was intimidation and violence?" The question was directed at Loretta, but she could feel the entire crowd waiting for her answer. This was the moment when she would either stand by Asa or abandon him, when she would choose between the safety of taking Vernon's offer and the risk of believing in a man whose past was more complicated than she'd imagined. She thought about her father's letter, about his advice to find someone worthy of standing beside her in the fight ahead. Someone to fight alongside her, not someone to take care of her. She thought about the way Asa had faced Vernon's lawyers with quiet courage, the way he'd offered to pretend to dance with her in a hotel parlor when what she'd needed most was a moment of grace. "Jacob Maddox may have been a hired gun," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "But Asa Boone is the man who's been repairing our church steps and fixing our broken hinges and reading to my students. He's the man who stood up to you and your lawyers when you tried to intimidate me. And he's the man I'm going to marry on Saturday." A murmur of approval rippled through parts of the crowd, but Vernon wasn't finished. "How touching, but legal sentiment won't change the facts. This man has admitted to using a false identity, which raises serious questions about the validity of any marriage he might enter into. I'm confident a judge will see the situation clearly." "Actually," said a new voice from the edge of the crowd, "a judge might be more interested in hearing about your own recent activities, Mr. Castleberry." Everyone turned to see a stranger approaching a tall man in a dusty traveling coat who moved with the purposeful stride of someone carrying official authority. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather portfolio that he opened to display a badge. "Deputy U.S. Marshal Tom Fletcher. I've been tracking Mr. Castleberry's movements for the past 2 weeks on behalf of several investors in Denver who've discovered some irregularities in his business dealings." Vernon's confident expression faltered. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "I mean the mining claims you sold them in Colorado that turned out to be worthless. The railroad stock certificates that were fraudulent. The land deals that existed only on paper." Marshal Fletcher's gaze swept the crowd. "Mr. Castleberry has been operating a sophisticated confidence scheme, using his family connections and social standing to gain access to wealthy investors." The revelation sent a shockwave through the assembled townspeople. Vernon, the man who'd been questioning everyone else's motives and integrity, was himself a criminal. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. "These are outrageous accusations," Vernon sputtered. "I demand to see proof of these alleged crimes." "You'll have plenty of opportunity to examine the evidence when you're in custody." Marshal Fletcher gestured to 2 men who'd been waiting at the edge of the crowd, federal agents who stepped forward with quiet efficiency of professionals. Vernon Castleberry, you're under arrest for mail fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy to defraud investors. As the agents moved to take Vernon into custody, he turned desperate eyes toward the crowd. This is a setup. They're all working together to steal my inheritance. Don't let them do this. But his words fell on ears that had heard enough. The man who'd been questioning everyone else's integrity was being led away in handcuffs, while the man whose past he'd tried to expose stood quietly beside the woman he'd promised to marry. Marshal Fletcher approached Asa as the crowd began to disperse. "Mr. Maddoxor, do you prefer Boone now?" "Boone, if you don't mind. That life is behind me." "I know. I worked with you on the Denver labor situation 5 years ago. You probably don't remember me, but I remember you walking away from the best-paying job you'd ever had because you couldn't stomach what they were asking you to do next." Asa nodded slowly. "I remember. You were the one who told me that a man's past doesn't have to define his future if he's willing to do the work to change. Still believe that, and from what I've seen here tonight, I'd say you've done the work." The marshal touched his hat brim respectfully. "Ma'am, you're getting a good man, whatever name he chooses to use." As the marshal and his prisoners departed, Loretta found herself alone with Asa in the gathering darkness. The revelation of his past had changed things between them, not because she thought less of him, but because she understood him better. The quiet strength she'd admired wasn't just natural confidence, it was hard, won wisdom earned through difficult choices and painful growth. "Are you sorry you asked?" he said quietly. "Sorry I know the truth? No. Sorry that you've carried that burden alone for so long? Yes." She turned to face him fully. "The wedding is still Saturday, if you still want to go through with it." "Do you?" "More than ever." His smile in the lamplight was worth every risk they'd taken to get here. Friday morning dawned grey and blustery, with the kind of wind that seemed to carry change in its gusts. Loretta woke early, her mind immediately turning to the wedding preparations that needed final attention. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Asa Boone, and despite everything that had happened with Vernon's arrest, she felt a flutter of nervous anticipation at the thought. She was pinning up her hair when Mrs. Mackenzie arrived with uncharacteristic urgency, her usually composed demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. "Miss Harlan, thank goodness you're awake. We have a problema, serious one." Loretta's stomach tightened. After Vernon's dramatic arrest, she'd thought their troubles were over, but clearly she'd been naive. "What kind of problem?" "Legal trouble. That fancy lawyer of Vernon's, the one with the spectacles, didn't leave town with the others. He's been holed up in the hotel all night, sending telegrams and receiving responses. And this morning, he's filed papers with the county courthouse." "What kind of papers?" Mrs. Mackenzie sank into a chair with the heavily dramatic gesture of a woman delivering grave news. "An injunction to halt your wedding. He's claiming that with Vernon under arrest, the entire inheritance situation needs to be reviewed by the courts before any marriage can take place." The words hit Loretta like cold water. Can he do that? "Apparently he can try. Judge Morrison's been summoned for an emergency hearing this afternoon. If the injunction is granted, you'll have to wait for a full court review before you can marry, and Lord knows how long that might take." Loretta's mind raced through the implications. Vernon might be in custody, but his legal team was still fighting to prevent her marriage. If they could delay the wedding long enough, they might find other grounds to challenge her inheritance or discover some technical violation that would invalidate her father's will entirely. "Where's Asa?" "That's the other thing. He left before dawn this morning. Mrs. Patterson saw him riding hard toward the county seat with a saddlebag full of papers. Whatever he's planning, he's in a powerful hurry to do it." The thought of Asa facing this legal challenge alone filled Loretta with a mixture of admiration and frustration. Even now, he was trying to protect her, to handle problems that were rightfully hers to solve. But marriage was supposed to be a partnership, and partners face difficulties together. "When is the hearing?" 2:00, in the courthouse at Miller's Creek. Miller's Creek was a hard 6-hour ride from Bellflower Bluff, which meant leaving immediately if she wanted to arrive in time. The alternative was sitting at home while others decided her fatia prospect that held no appeal whatsoever. "Mrs. Mackenzie, I need you to saddle Daisy for me, and send word to Reverend Harrison that the wedding might be delayed." "Delayed? Child, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that if there's going to be a legal battle over my future, I intend to be present for it." The older woman's expression shifted from concern to admiration. "Your father would be proud, but riding alone to Miller's Creek won't be necessary." The voice from the doorway belonged to Henrik Johansson, the elderly blacksmith. Behind him stood Tom Patterson, young Timothy, and half a dozen other men from town. "If Miss Harlan's going to court, she shouldn't go alone." "Mr. Johansson, that's very kind, but—" "No but about it. That man of yours stood up for what was right when it mattered. Now it's our turn to stand up for both of you." The gesture of support brought tears to her eyes. These people, her neighbors, her students' parents, the community her father had helped build, were willing to drop everything to support her fight. It was exactly the kind of loyalty that made Bellflower Bluff worth saving. The ride to Miller's Creek was accomplished in grim determination rather than conversation. The men who'd volunteered to accompany her were working people who couldn't easily afford to lose a day's wages, but they rode with the purposeful resolve of those defending something precious. As they covered the miles between their home and the county seat, Loretta found herself thinking about the difference between legal technicalities and moral truth. Vernon's lawyer might have grounds for his injunction, but the spirit of her father's will was clear. He'd wanted her to find someone worthy of standing beside her. In Asa, she'd found exactly that, a man whose past mistakes had forged him into someone capable of choosing love over profit, commitment over convenience. They reached Miller's Creek just as the courthouse clock chimed 1:30. The building buzzed with activity unusual for a county seat that normally handled routine property disputes and minor criminal cases. Word of the Harlan inheritance case had apparently spread, drawing curious spectators and interested parties from across the region. Inside the courthouse, Loretta spotted Asa immediately. He stood near the front of the courtroom in conversation with a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit, clearly a lawyer, but not one of Vernon's team. When Asa saw her enter, his face lit up with relief and something that might have been pride. "Loretta, I wasn't sure you'd make it in time. Did you really think I'd let you handle this alone?" His smile suggested that he'd hoped, rather than expected, she would come. "There's someone I'd like you to meet. This is Samuel Morrison, Judge, Morrison's brother and one of the finest lawyers in the territory." The distinguished man offered a respectful bow. "Miss Harlan, Mr. Boone has told me quite a story. I understand you're facing some creative legal maneuvering designed to prevent your marriage." "That's one way to put it. Can they really stop us from marrying?" "They can try, but they'll discover that your fiancé is more resourceful than they anticipated." Before she could ask what he meant, the bailiff called for order as Judge Morrison entered the courtroom. A stern-faced man in his 60s with graying hair and penetrating blue eyes, he commanded immediate respect from everyone present. "I understand we're here on an emergency petition regarding the Harlan estate. Mr. Whitfield, you may present your arguments." Vernon's lawyer rose with the confidence of a man who believed victory was assured. "Your Honor, my client Vernon Castleberry was unlawfully arrested yesterday on trumped-up charges designed to prevent him from protecting his legitimate interests in his late uncle's estate. In his absence, Miss Harlan is attempting to rush into a marriage of obvious convenience with a man who has admitted to using a false identity." "Objection, Your Honor." Samuel Morrison's voice carried the authority of long experience. "Mr. Castleberry was arrested by federal marshals on valid warrants for securities fraud. His legal troubles have nothing to do with Miss Harlan's right to marry whomever she chooses. Furthermore," Morrison continued, "the supposed emergency that justifies this injunction is entirely manufactured. Miss Harlan's marriage will satisfy the requirements of her father's will regardless of when it takes place, and there's no legal basis for preventing two consenting adults from entering into matrimony." Judge Morrison studied the papers before him with careful attention. "Mr. Whitfield, What specific legal grounds do you claim for this injunction? The marriage appears to be fraudulent, Your Honor, entered into solely for financial gain rather than genuine affection. Such arrangements mock the sanctity of marriage and clearly violate the spirit of Thomas Harlan's testamentary intentions. And what evidence do you offer for this claim? Whitfield shuffled his papers with less confidence than he'd displayed moments earlier. The extremely brief courtship, the defendant's use of a false identity, his obvious financial incentives, none of which constitute legal grounds for preventing a marriage. Judge Morrison's tone suggested his patience was wearing thin. Do you have any evidence of coercion, fraud, or other criminal activity? Well, no, Your Honor, but then I fail to see the emergency that justifies this court's intervention in private matters between consenting adults. Loretta felt a surge of hope, but Samuel Morrison wasn't finished. He rose with the measured confidence of a man preparing to deliver a decisive blow. Your Honor, there's another matter that makes this injunction not only unjustified, but potentially harmful to my clients. Miss Harlan is not merely planning to marry Mr. Boone to satisfy her father's will. She's already married to him. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs. Loretta stared at Morrison in shock, certain she'd misheard. Married? That was impossible. They hadn't even had the ceremony yet. Morrison reached into his briefcase and withdrew a document that he presented to the judge. This is a certificate of marriage, filed this morning with the Territorial Registry Office. Miss Harlan and Mr. Boone were married by proxy yesterday evening, with proper legal witnesses and full documentation. Married by proxy? Judge Morrison examined the certificate with raised eyebrows. On what grounds? Exigent circumstances created by Mr. Castleberry's interference. When it became clear that legal maneuvers might prevent or delay their planned wedding, my clients chose to ensure their union couldn't be disrupted by technicalities. Loretta found her voice at last. But I didn't sign anything. Asa turned to face her, his expression both apologetic and determined. You gave me power of attorney yesterday when we went to the bank to arrange the financial documents. That power included the authority to act on your behalf in legal matters. The memory came flooding back. In the midst of wedding preparations, they'd visited the bank to establish joint accounts and transfer property titles. She'd signed several documents, including what she'd assumed was a standard power of attorney for financial matters. She'd trusted Asa completely, never imagining he might use that authority for something as momentous as marriage. You married me without my knowledge? I married you to protect you from exactly this kind of legal manipulation. Once the marriage is established, Vernon's lawyers can't claim it's fraudulent or rushed. We've been married for over 12 hours, plenty of time to have second thoughts if either of us wanted to back out. Judge Morrison studied the marriage certificate carefully. This appears to be in order. Mr. Whitfield, your injunction is moot. The marriage you sought to prevent has already taken place. But, Your Honor, surely a marriage by proxy without the bride's explicit consent is perfectly legal under territorial law when proper power of attorney exists. Morrison banged his gavel with finality. This court finds no grounds for the requested injunction. The marriage stands, and the inheritance requirements are satisfied. As the legal proceedings concluded around her, Loretta found herself studying the man who was now, apparently, her husband. Asa watched her with careful attention, clearly trying to gauge her reaction to his dramatic action. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the uncertainty in his dark eyes, as he waited to discover whether she would forgive him for making such a momentous decision without consulting her. The practical part of her mind recognized the brilliance of his strategy. By marrying her through legal proxy, he'd eliminated Vernon's ability to challenge their union as fraudulent or rushed. The marriage was established fact now, not future intent, which made it nearly impossible to overturn. But the woman in Hertha, part that had been looking forward to walking down the church aisle in her mother's dress, to speaking vows before their community, to beginning their life together with ceremony and celebration, felt robbed of something precious. Mrs. Boone, Samuel Morrison said, approaching with a satisfied smile, congratulations on your marriage. Your husband is to be commended for his quick thinking. Mrs. Boone. The name felt strange on her ears, like wearing clothes tailored for someone else. She was married legally, permanently, irrevocably bound to a man who'd taken the most important decision of her life out of her hands, ostensibly for her own protection. As they left the courthouse, surrounded by well-wishers and supporters, Loretta found herself wondering whether she'd gained a partner or simply traded one form of control for another. The ride back to Bellflower Bluff passed in tense silence, broken only by the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats and the whisper of wind through prairie grass. Loretta rode beside her husbander, word that still felt foreign and unsettling, while their supporters maintained a respectful distance behind them. The men who'd accompanied her to court sensed the undercurrents of conflict between the newlyweds and wisely chose to give them space to work through whatever needed working through. Asa had attempted conversation twice during the first hour, but Loretta's responses had been so coolly polite that he'd eventually fallen silent. She could feel his sideways glances, could sense his growing concern about her reaction to his unilateral decision. Good. Let him worry. Let him wonder whether his brilliant legal strategy had cost him the very thing he'd been trying to protect. As the familiar landmarks of home came into view, Loretta found herself thinking about the wedding dress hanging in her wardrobe, the flowers Mrs. Mackenzie had ordered, the cake that had been planned for tomorrow's celebration. All of it rendered meaningless by a proxy marriage she'd known nothing about until it was announced in open court. "We need to talk," Asa said as they reached the edge of town. "Yes, we do." They parted company with their escorts at the livery stable, accepting congratulations and well wishes with the mechanical politeness of people whose minds were elsewhere. The news of their proxy marriage had apparently reached Bellflower Bluff. Ahead of them, several townspeople approached with questions and comments that Loretta answered with automatic courtesy, while her thoughts churned with frustration and confusion. Mrs. Mackenzie appeared as they walked toward the boarding house, her face bright with excitement. "Mr. and Mrs. Boone, oh, how wonderfully clever of you to outsmart those nasty lawyers. When word came that you'd already been married, I nearly wept with joy. Though I must say, I'm heartbroken about the dress, such beautiful work, and now no occasion to wear it." "There might still be an occasion," Asa said quietly, his eyes on Loretta's face, "if my wife would like a proper ceremony to mark our union." The word wife, spoken in his deep voice, sent an unexpected shiver through her, but she wasn't ready to be mollified by romantic gestures. "What I would like is a private conversation with my husband about decisions that affect both of our futures." Mrs. Mackenzie's cheerful expression faltered as she caught the undercurrent of tension. "Of course, dears. You'll want to discuss your new arrangements. I've already prepared the larger room for you, both the one with the sitting area and the lovely view of the mountains." "That won't be necessary," Loretta said firmly. "Mr. Boone can keep his current room. I'll be staying at my own house." The older woman's eyebrows rose, but she nodded with diplomatic understanding. "As you wish. Marriage takes adjusting, doesn't it? You'll work things out in your own time." They walked to Loretta's house in continued silence, but once the front door closed behind them, the careful politeness evaporated like morning mist. "You had no right," Loretta said, turning to face him in the front hallway. "No right to make that decision without consulting me. No right to use the power of attorney I gave you for financial matters to enter me into marriage, and certainly no right to let me discover I was married by hearing it announced in open court." Asa removed his hat and set it carefully on the hall table, his movements deliberate and controlled. "You're absolutely right. I overstepped, and I owe you an apology." "An apology?" Her voice rose with the force of emotions she'd been suppressing all day. "Asa, you took away my choice. The most important decision a woman can make, and you made it for me because you decided you knew what was best. I made it because I was afraid of losing you." The simple honesty of the statement stopped her building tirade in its tracks. She studied his face, seeing vulnerability beneath the calm exterior she'd come to associate with his careful self-control. "What do you mean?" "I mean that watching Vernon's lawyers work yesterday, seeing how determined they were to prevent our marriage, how willing they were to use any tactic to achieve their goals, I realized they might succeed. Not through superior legal arguments, but through delay and technicalities and procedural manipulations that could tie up the courts for months. He moved into the sitting room, and she followed, drawn by the quiet intensity in his voice. And during those months, you'd be fighting alone while I— He paused, running a hand through his dark hair. While I would be exactly what Vernon claimed I was. A fortune hunter hanging around, hoping to benefit from your troubles. That's not what you are, isn't it? As long as our marriage remained in the future, as long as I had no legal standing in your life, every action I took on your behalf could be questioned. Every piece of advice I offered, every time I stood up to your enemies, someone could claim I was motivated by financial gain rather than genuine concern. She sank into her father's chair, beginning to understand the logic that had driven his decision. So you married me to establish your right to protect me. I married you because I love you, and because I couldn't bear the thought of losing you to legal technicalities when I had the power to prevent it. He knelt beside her chair, his dark eyes serious and intent. But you're right about the choice. I should have discussed it with you first, should have found a way to include you in the decision, even if time was short. Why didn't you? Because I was afraid you'd say no. Not to the marriage itself, but to doing it that way, through legal maneuvering instead of the ceremony you'd planned. I was afraid you'd want to take the risk, to fight it out in court rather than compromise your vision of how our wedding should happen. The admission hung between them, honest and painful. Loretta found herself looking at this man who'd become her husband without her knowledge, trying to reconcile her anger at his presumption with her growing understanding of his motivations. You were probably right, she said finally. I would have wanted to fight it out, to prove that we could win on the merits rather than through legal tricks. And we might have lost everything while we were proving our principles. We might have. She studied his face, noting the lines of tension around his eyes, the careful way he held himself, as if braced for rejection. But Asa, marriage is supposed to be a partnership. Partners don't make major decisions alone, even when they think they're protecting each other. I know, and I promise you, it won't happen again. From now on, every important decision gets discussed between us before any action is taken. Even if you think I'm wrong. Especially if I think you're wrong. That's when discussion matters most. The sincerity in his voice began to ease some of the tight anger in her chest. She could see that he understood what he'd done wrong, that he was genuinely committed to doing better in the future. But understanding his motivations didn't automatically resolve the hurt of having such an important moment taken away from her. I had dreams about our wedding, she said quietly. About walking down the church aisle in my mother's dress, about speaking vows in front of our community, about beginning our life together with celebration and joy. Instead, I found out I was married when a lawyer announced it in court as a legal strategy. Pain flickered across his features. I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry for taking that away from you. Are you? Or are you just sorry that I'm upset about it? The question seemed to surprise him, but he considered it seriously before answering. Both. I'm sorry you're hurt, but I'm also sorry I acted without your input. If I had it to do over again, I'd find a way to include you in the decision, even if it meant taking greater risks. The commitment in his voice was exactly what she needed to hear. This wasn't just diplomatic regret designed to smooth over conflict, it was genuine understanding of why his actions had been wrong. There's something else we need to discuss, she said. Our living arrangements. Now that we're legally married, people will expect us to behave like a married couple. And what does that mean to you? I don't know yet. 3 days ago, we had an arrangement with clear boundaries. Now we're husband and wife, bound together by law and community expectations. I need time to figure out what that means for us personally. Asa nodded slowly. What do you need from me while you're figuring it out? Patience, honesty, and a willingness to let our relationship develop naturally instead of being forced by circumstances or expectations. You have all of that. A knock at the front door interrupted their conversation. Loretta opened it to find Timothy Patterson standing on the porch, shifting nervously from foot to foot in the way that suggested he was carrying important news. "Mrs. Boone, ma'am." He stopped, flushed with embarrassment. Miss Harlan. Mrs. Boone is fine, Timothy. What brings you here?" "Mars sent me to tell you that there's been developments about Mr. Castlebury and those lawyers of his." Asa joined them at the door. "What kind of developments?" "The kind that means your troubles might not be over after all. Ma says to tell you that the lawyer who stayed behind the one with the spectacles, she's been meeting with folks from out of town. Important-looking folks with expensive clothes and hard faces." A chill ran down Loretta's spine. "What kind of meetings?" "Don't rightly know, ma'am. But Ma heard talk about bringing in new evidence, about challenging the marriage on different grounds. And there's been men asking questions about the railroad spur, about mineral rights, about who owns what land around here." Asa's expression had gone grim. "How many men?" "Half-dozen, maybe more. They're staying at the hotel in Miller's Creek, but they've been riding out here every day, surveying and measuring and taking notes." The implications were becoming clear. Vernon's arrest had eliminated one threat, but it had apparently triggered the attention of other people with deeper pockets and fewer scruples about how they achieved their goals. The Harlan inheritance wasn't just valuable to Vernon, it was valuable to anyone who understood the potential of the territory's mineral rights and railroad development. "Timothy, tell your mother we appreciate the warning, and ask her to keep us informed about any new developments." The boy nodded and raced off, leaving Loretta and Asa alone, with the realization that their legal victory might have been premature. They'd won the battle over their right to marry, but the war for control of her inheritance was apparently just beginning. "What do you think they're planning?" Loretta asked. "Something that requires detailed knowledge of your property holdings and legal vulnerabilities. The fact that they're surveying the land suggests they're looking for ways to challenge your ownership that go beyond the marriage requirement. Such as mineral rights disputes, eminent domain claims for railroad development, challenges to your father's original land. Patents. There are dozens of ways to tie up property ownership in court if you have the resources and the motivation." Loretta felt the weight of exhaustion settling over her shoulders. Just when she'd thought they'd solved their problems, new threats were emerging from directions she hadn't even considered. Her father's inheritance wasn't just a blessing, it was a target that would apparently attract predators until she found a way to defend it permanently. "So what do we do?" Asa's expression hardened with resolve. "We get ready for war." The attack came at dawn on Sunday morning, when most of Bellflower Bluff's residents were either sleeping late or preparing for church services. Loretta woke to the sound of horses moving too fast through the quiet streets, followed by shouting and the sharp crack of gunfire. She threw on her robe and rushed to the window, her heart hammering as she took in the scene unfolding below. A dozen armed men on horseback had surrounded the town's main buildings, the bank, the general store, the hotel, and most importantly, her father's land office, where all the property records were kept. They moved with military precision, clearly following a predetermined plan. Asa appeared at her front door before she could fully process what was happening. He dressed hastily but completely, and she could see the outline of a gun beneath his coat, a reminder that Jacob Maddox had been a man accustomed to violence, even if Asa Boone preferred peaceful solutions. "Stay inside and away from the windows," he said without preamble. "This isn't random." "What do you mean?" Someone's making a play for your property, and they're not planning to rely on legal maneuvers alone." Through the window, she could see the armed men taking positions around key buildings, while their leader, a tall man in an expensive coat, dismounted in front of the land office. Even from a distance, there was something familiar about his bearing, the way he carried himself with unconscious authority. "Do you recognize him?" Asa studied the figure through the glass, his expression growing darker. "Marcus Webb. I worked with him during my Pinkerton days. He specializes in situations where legal pressure needs to be backed up with more direct persuasion." "You mean intimidation?" "Whatever it takes to secure his employer's objectives." If Webb's here, it means someone with serious money has decided to take your inheritance by force rather than waiting for the courts to sort things out. The implications sent ice through her veins. The proxy marriage had protected them from Vernon's legal challenges, but it had apparently triggered a response from more dangerous enemies, people willing to use violence to achieve their goals. What do they want? Probably the property deeds and mineral rights documents. If they can physically seize the records and destroy or alter them, they can create enough legal confusion to tie up your ownership claims for years. A new sound joined the chaos outside the rapid clanging of the church bell, rung in the irregular pattern that served as Bellflower Bluff's emergency signal. Someone was alerting the community to danger, calling for help, or warning people to take shelter. "That's Mrs. Mackenzie," Loretta said, recognizing the particular rhythm. "She must be in the church tower." "Good, at least someone's raising the alarm." Asa checked his weapon with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd done it countless times before. "But we can't wait for help that might not come. If Webb's here for the property records, we need to get to them first. The land office is surrounded." "The front entrance is, but your father was a careful man. He built that office with a back exit that connects to the alley behind the general store. If we can reach it without being seen, we might be able to secure the documents before Webb's men break in." The plan was dangerous, requiring them to move through town while armed men controlled the main streets. But the alternative, allowing Webb to seize or destroy the legal foundation of her inheritance, was worse. "Give me 2 minutes to dress properly." She changed into dark, practical clothing while Asa watched the street, tracking the movements of Webb's men. When she joined him at the door, he handed her a small pistol that felt heavy and alien in her palm. "Do you know how to use this?" "My father taught me to shoot when I was 12, but I've never—" "Hopefully you won't have to, but if someone threatens you directly, don't hesitate. These aren't men who'll be deterred by conscience or appeals to honor." They slipped out through her back garden, moving carefully from building to building while staying out of sight of the main street. The town felt different, with armed strangers controlling its heart-familiar spaces, transformed into dangerous territory where a wrong step could mean disaster. As they approached the alley behind the land office, Asa held up a hand for silence. Voices carried from the front of the building Webb's men, discussing their strategy for breaking into the heavily secured structure that housed Bellflower Bluff's official records. "Told you to bring the tools. Reinforced door won't give way easily. Just blow the damn thing if you have to." Asa gestured toward the building's rear entrance, a narrow door hidden behind overgrown bushes that her father had installed as emergency access. They reached it without being detected, but the door was locked with a mechanism that looked formidable in the morning light. "Can you open it?" "Give me a minute." Asa produced a set of small tools from his pocket, another reminder of skills learned during his Pinkerton years. The lock yielded to his experienced touch, clicking open with a sound that seemed dangerously loud in the quiet alley. Inside, the land office felt like a tomb. Thick stone walls muffled the sounds from the street, and dust motes danced in shafts of light that filtered through high windows. Rows of filing cabinets and document safes contained the legal history of every property transaction in the county, including all the papers related to her father's extensive holdings. "Where are your documents kept?" "The main safe, behind father's desk. But it requires 2 keys to open mine and the county clerk's." "Do you have your key?" She produced it from the chain around her neck, but the second key posed a more serious problem. County Clerk Williams lived on the other side of town and might already be trapped in his house by Webb's men. A sudden crash from the front of the building announced that Webb's patience had run out. They were breaking down the main door, which meant they had perhaps minutes before armed men flooded the office. "We need those documents," Asa said grimly. "Without them, Webb can claim your property rights are invalid and tie up the inheritance in court indefinitely. Then we need to get Mr. Williams' key." "That's impossible now. Webb's men control the streets." Loretta studied the massive safe that contained her family's legacy, then looked at the tools in Asa's hands. "Can you open it without the second key?" "Maybe, but it would take time we don't have. Another crash from the front suggested that the outer door was giving way. Soon Webb's men would be inside, searching for the very documents that could secure or destroy her future. "There's another option," she said quietly. "The emergency protocol my father established." "What kind of protocol?" "If the office was ever threatened by fire or flood, he created a way to quickly remove the most important documents. There's a hidden compartment behind the safe that contains copies of all the major property deeds and mineral rights certificates. Show me." She led him to a section of apparently solid wall behind the safe. Her father had taught her the mechanism years ago, making her practice until she could find the hidden lever by touch alone. The wall panel swung open to reveal a fireproof strongbox containing dozens of legal documents, the foundation of her inheritance and the target of Webb's raid. Brilliant man, your father. He understood that powerful men sometimes take what they want, regardless of legal niceties. She began stuffing documents into a leather satchel, working quickly but carefully to ensure nothing important was left behind. They were nearly finished when the sound of splintering wood announced that Webb's men had broken through the main door. Heavy footsteps echoed through the outer office, accompanied by rough voices discussing their search strategy. "Check every filing cabinet. Main safe's over here. Find those property deeds or Webb will have our heads." Asa closed the hidden panel carefully, leaving no sign that it had been disturbed. But they were trapped in the back office with armed men between them and their escape route. "Window?" Loretta whispered. "Too high and too visible. We'd be easy targets." The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by the sound of filing cabinets being forced open and papers scattered across the floor. Within minutes, Webb's men would search the back office and discover them hiding with the very documents they'd come to steal. Then Asa smiled, the first relaxed expression she'd seen from him all morning. "What? Your father was even more careful than I thought. Look at the floor." She followed his gaze and saw what she'd missed before, a section of floorboards that didn't quite match the rest, marked with barely visible scratches that suggested frequent use. A tunnel? Or at least a crawl space. Your father really didn't trust anyone, did he? He trusted the right people. Everyone else he prepared for. The hidden floor panel opened to reveal a narrow passage that led beneath the building toward the church. It was dusty and dark, barely wide enough for an adult to crawl through, but it offered escape when no other options remained. "Ladies first," Asa whispered. As Loretta squeezed into the tunnel with the precious documents clutched against her chest, she could hear Webb's men entering the back office above them. In a few moments, they would discover the hidden compartment and realize that someone had beaten them to their prize. The real confrontation was just beginning. The tunnel was a nightmare of cramped darkness and spiderwebs, but it delivered them safely to the church basement. They emerged dusty and breathless into the familiar space where Sunday school classes were held and church suppers, organizada, jarring contrast to the life-or-death circumstances that had driven them underground. Above them, they could hear Mrs. Mackenzie still ringing the emergency bell, though the pattern had changed to shorter, more urgent bursts. Through the basement windows, Loretta could see people moving carefully through backyards and alleys, avoiding the main streets where Webb's men maintained their positions. "We need to get word to the territorial authorities," Asa said, checking the documents to ensure they'd survived the crawl intact. "But Webb's probably cut the telegraph lines and blocked the main roads." "There's another way. The Henderson Ranch has a telegraph station, and it's only 8 miles through the hills behind the town. If we can reach it." "Too dangerous. Webb will have scouts watching all the escape routes." A sound from upstairs interrupted their planning footsteps, moving through the church sanctuary with deliberate purpose. Someone was searching the building, probably looking for them after discovering their escape from the land office. Asa drew his gun and moved toward the stairs, his movements carrying the fluid efficiency of a man who'd faced similar situations before. "Stay here and keep those documents safe. If something happens to me, get them to the territorial capital by whatever means necessary. I'm not leaving you to face this alone." "Loretta, we're partners now, remember? Partners don't abandon each other when things get dangerous. Before he could argue further, a familiar voice called down from above. Miss Harlan, Mr. Boone, if you're down there, you'd better come up. We've got a situation developing that requires your immediate attention. They exchanged glances of relief and surprise. The voice belonged to Samuel Morrison, the lawyer who'd helped them in court. They found him in the church sanctuary, along with a dozen townspeople who'd apparently taken refuge in the building. Morrison looked grimmer than he had during their legal victory, his expensive suit dusty, and his usually perfect composure showing cracks. Mr. Morrison, what are you doing here? Representing some very concerned clients who've discovered that certain parties are attempting to seize property through illegal means. He gestured toward the windows where Webb's men could be seen maintaining their positions. This Marcus Webb and his associates have made a serious miscalculation. What kind of miscalculation? They assumed they were dealing with an isolated community that couldn't defend itself. They didn't realize that the Harlan inheritance includes partnerships and agreements with some very powerful interests that don't appreciate having their investments threatened by hired thugs. As if to underscore his point, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the eastern road. Through the church windows, they could see a large group of riders approaching at speed too many and too well organized to be random travelers. Territorial marshals, Morrison explained with satisfaction, along with representatives from the Denver Mining Consortium and the Transcontinental Railroad Company. It seems that when Mr. Webb's employers decided to take direct action against your property, they inadvertently declared war on some very influential people. Webb's men had apparently seen the approaching riders as well. Shouts of alarm and hasty commands suggested they were realizing that their carefully planned raid had become a potential disaster. "How did you know to bring help?" Loretta asked. "Your husband sent word yesterday through channels that most people don't know exist. When a former Pinkerton agent with his reputation sends a coded message saying that Marcus Webb is planning illegal action against property interests, certain people pay attention." Asa's expression suggested he was as surprised by this development as anyone. "I sent general warnings about potential trouble, but I didn't expect such a rapid response. You have more friends than you realize. People remember Jacob Maddox as someone who walked away from a lucrative career rather than compromise his principles. That kind of integrity creates loyalty." The situation outside was developing rapidly. Webb's men found themselves outnumbered and outgunned by federal marshals with legal authority to arrest them. But Webb himself was too experienced to surrender without making one final play. "He's moving toward the bank," Asa observed, watching through the window as Webb and two of his men broke away from the main group. "He's going for the financial records." "Why would he want those?" "Because if he can't steal your property through legal manipulation, he'll try to bankrupt you through financial sabotage. Your father's accounts, investment records, loan documents, all of it's vulnerable if Webb can access the bank." The bank building stood across the main street from the church, a solid stone structure that normally projected security and stability. But against armed men willing to use explosives, its defenses were limited. "We have to stop him," Loretta said. "The marshals will handle it." "The marshals are busy arresting his men. Webb's using the confusion to achieve his real objective." She was right. While the federal agents rounded up the hired gunmen, Webb himself was disappearing into the bank with the tools and expertise needed to crack its vault. If he succeeded in destroying or altering her father's financial records, he could create legal chaos that would take years to resolve. "What do you propose we do about it?" "We stop him ourselves." Asa studied her face, clearly recognizing the determination that had driven her to fight for her inheritance from the beginning. "That's extremely dangerous. Webb's not a man who hesitates to use violence when cornered. Neither apparently are you." "That's different. I have experience with this kind of situation, and I have everything to lose if he succeeds." Before Asa could argue further, Morrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "If I might suggest, there's a way to handle this that doesn't require either of you to risk direct confrontation with an armed criminal." "Such as?" The bank vault has a unique security feature that most people don't know about. Thomas Harlan insisted on installing it when the bank was built, a secondary locking mechanism that can only be opened from outside the building. Loretta stared at him. My father had external control over the bank vault? Emergency access, in case of situations exactly like this. He was deeply suspicious of anyone who might try to manipulate the financial system for personal gain. Where's the external control? Underground, accessible through the storm drain system that runs beneath the main street. If someone could reach it and activate the secondary locks, anyone inside the vault would be trapped until the authorities could arrest them. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, but it required someone to navigate the underground drainage tunnels while Webb worked inside the bank above. And it required perfect timing too early, and Webb would have time to escape. Too late, and he'd accomplish his sabotage and disappear. I'll go, Asa said without hesitation. We'll go, Loretta corrected. I know those tunnels better than anyone. My father made me memorize the entire drainage system when I was a child, in case the town ever flooded. Absolutely not. Asa, we don't have time to argue about this. I know the way, I know the mechanism, and I'm small enough to move quickly through spaces that might slow you down. She could see him wanting to refuse, wanting to protect her from danger, even if it meant accepting a lower chance of success. But she could also see him recognizing the logic of her argument, the practical necessity of using every advantage they possessed. Together, then. But we do this my way, carefully, quietly, and with multiple backup plans. Morrison provided them with a rough map of the drainage system and explained the mechanism they needed to activate. It was simpler than expected, a manual override, designed to be operated by someone who understood the basic principles of mechanical engineering. As they prepared to enter the storm drains through an access point behind the church, Loretta found herself thinking about her father's foresight in creating so many hidden safeguards. He'd understood that building something worth protecting required planning for every possible threat. Ready? Asa asked, checking his equipment one final time. Ready. They descended into the darkness beneath Bellflower Bluff, carrying with them the hopes of a community and the weight of decisions that would determine whether her father's legacy survived or crumbled under the assault of men who saw everything in terms of profit and loss. Above them, Webb worked in the bank vault, unaware that the woman whose inheritance he sought to steal was crawling through tunnels to ensure his capture. The storm drains beneath Bellflower Bluff were dry but treacherous, filled with debris and unexpected obstacles that made progress slow and dangerous. Loretta led the way through the cramped tunnels, following memorized routes through darkness that seemed to press against them like a living thing. Behind her, Asa moved with the careful quiet of a man who understood that discovery would mean disaster for both of them. They reached the access point beneath the bank, just as sounds of forced entry echoed through the drainage system. Webb had apparently given up on subtle approaches and was using explosives to break into the vault. The concussion from above sent dust and small stones raining down around them, a reminder of how precarious their position truly was. There, Loretta whispered, pointing to a mechanical assembly that looked like something from a clockmaker's workshop. Gears, levers, and cables connected to a series of steel rods that disappeared upward into the building's foundation. The secondary locking mechanism. Asa examined the device with the focused attention of someone whose life depended on understanding its function. Your father was more paranoid than I gave him credit for. He preferred the term prepared. How does it work? Simple mechanical advantage. When we activate this lever, steel bolts shoot into place around the vault door from the inside. Anyone inside becomes trapped until someone manually reverses the process from out here. Another explosion from above sent more debris cascading around them. Webb was making rapid progress, which meant they had perhaps minutes before he completed whatever sabotage he'd planned and attempted to escape. Do it. Asa grasped the main lever and threw his weight against it. For a moment, nothing happened. Years of disuse had made the mechanism stiff and reluctant. Then, with a grinding sound that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space, the steel rods began to move upward. The effect was immediate. The sounds of destruction from the vault suddenly stopped, replaced by muffled shouting and the sound of someone frantically trying to force a door that would no longer budge. "He's trapped," Loretta said with satisfaction. "For now, but Webb's resourceful. He'll find another way out, if we give him time." They made their way back through the tunnels with greater speed, driven by the knowledge that their part in the immediate crisis was finished, but the larger confrontation still awaited. When they emerged behind the church, they found the town transformed. Federal marshals had taken control of the main street, rounding up Webb's men with the efficient competence of professionals who'd handled similar situations many times before. Samuel Morrison stood in animated conversation with a man wearing the uniform of a territorial judge, while several well-dressed civilians examined documents that had been spread across a makeshift table. Mrs. Mackenzie approached them with obvious relief. "Mr. and Mrs. Boone, thank goodness you're safe. We heard explosions from the bank and feared the worst." "Webb's trapped in the vault," Asa reported. "But we should let the marshals handle the extraction." "No need," said a familiar voice. Marshal Fletcher approached, with a satisfied expression and iron manacles dangling from his belt. "Mr. Webb emerged from the bank vault 5 minutes ago, with his hands up and a very cooperative attitude. It seems he realized that destroying financial records while trapped inside a building controlled by federal agents was not his wisest career decision." "What about his employers, the people who sent him here?" "That's where things get interesting. It turns out that Mr. Webb's employers were operating on false information provided by Vernon Castleberry before his arrest. They believed they were investing in legitimate mining claims and railroad development rights, not participating in an inheritance fraud scheme." Morrison joined their conversation, his expression reflecting professional satisfaction. When confronted with evidence of Mr. Castleberry's deception, the storm drains beneath Bellflower Bluff were dry but treacherous, filled with debris and unexpected obstacles that made progress slow and dangerous. Loretta led the way through the cramped tunnels, following memorized routes through darkness that seemed to press against them like a living thing. Behind her, Asa moved with the careful quiet of a man who understood that discovery would mean disaster for both of them. They reached the access point beneath the bank, just as sounds of forced entry echoed through the drainage system. Webb had apparently given up on subtle approaches and was using explosives to break into the vault. The concussion from above sent dust and small stones raining down around them, a reminder of how precarious their position truly was. "There," Loretta whispered, pointing to a mechanical assembly that looked like something from a clockmaker's workshop. Gears, levers and cables connected to a series of steel rods that disappeared upward into the building's foundation. The secondary locking mechanism. Asa examined the device with the focused attention of someone whose life depended on understanding its function. "Your father was more paranoid than I gave him credit for. He preferred the term prepared. How does it work?" "Simple mechanical advantage. When we activate this lever, steel bolts shoot into place around the vault door from the inside. Anyone inside becomes trapped until someone manually reverses the process from out here." Another explosion from above sent more debris cascading around them. Webb was making rapid progress, which meant they had perhaps minutes before he completed whatever sabotage he'd planned and attempted to escape. "Do it." Asa grasped the main lever and threw his weight against it. For a moment, nothing happened. Years of disuse had made the mechanism stiff and reluctant. Then, with a grinding sound that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space, the steel rods began to move upward. The effect was immediate. The sounds of destruction from the vault suddenly stopped, replaced by muffled shouting and the sound of someone frantically trying to force a door that would no longer budge. "He's trapped," Loretta said with satisfaction. "For now, but Webb's resourceful. He'll find another way out, if we give him time." They made their way back through the tunnels with greater speed, driven by the knowledge that their part in the immediate crisis was finished, but the larger confrontation still awaited. When they emerged behind the church, they found the town transformed. Federal marshals had taken control of the main street, rounding up Webb's men with the efficient competence of professionals who'd handled similar situations many times before. Samuel Morrison stood in animated conversation with a man wearing the uniform of a territorial judge, while several well-dressed civilians examined documents that had been spread across a makeshift table. Mrs. Mackenzie approached them with obvious relief. "Mr. and Mrs. Boone, thank goodness you're safe. We heard explosions from the bank and feared the worst." "Webb's trapped in the vault," Asa reported. "But we should let the marshals handle the extraction." "No need," said a familiar voice. Marshal Fletcher approached, with a satisfied expression and iron manacles dangling from his belt. "Mr. Webb emerged from the bank vault 5 minutes ago, with his hands up and a very cooperative attitude. It seems he realized that destroying financial records while trapped inside a building controlled by federal agents was not his wisest career decision." "What about his employers? The people who sent him here?" "That's where things get interesting. It turns out that Mr. Webb's employers were operating on false information provided by Vernon Castleberry before his arrest. They believed they were investing in legitimate mining claims and railroad development rights, not participating in an inheritance fraud scheme." Morrison joined their conversation, his expression reflecting professional satisfaction. When confronted with evidence of Mr. Castleberry's deception, Webb's backers immediately withdrew their support and cooperated fully with federal authorities. "They're businessmen, not criminals, and they have no interest in being associated with fraud or violence." "So it's over?" Loretta asked, hardly daring to believe that the threats to her inheritance had finally been resolved. "The immediate threats, yes. Vernon Castleberry will face federal charges for securities fraud, and Marcus Webb will be prosecuted for attempted robbery and destruction of property. Their various schemes to steal your inheritance have collapsed entirely." Marshal Fletcher nodded agreement. "More importantly, the territorial government has taken a direct interest in this case. They're implementing new protections for inheritance rights and property ownership to prevent similar situations in the future." As the officials continued their discussions, Loretta found herself looking around at the community her father had built and she'd fought to preserve. People were emerging from their homes and businesses, tentatively reclaiming their streets from the armed strangers who'd briefly controlled them. Children played in the dusty roads while their parents swept up debris and began the process of returning to normal life. But for Loretta, there could be no return to the way things had been before. Too much had changed in her circumstances, in her relationships, and in her understanding of what she wanted from life. "Asa," she said quietly, drawing him aside as the crowd began to disperse. "We need to discuss what happens next." "You mean with the marriage?" "I mean with us, with our future together." They walked toward her house in comfortable silence, both apparently needing time to process everything that had happened. The proxy marriage that had seemed like such a violation of her autonomy now felt like the foundation of something precious, not because of how it had begun, but because of what they'd built together since. "I've been thinking about what you said," she continued as they reached her front porch. "About making important decisions together, about being true partners. And I've realized that marriage isn't just about legal arrangements or property rights. It's about choosing to build a life with someone, to face whatever comes next as a team rather than as individuals." Asa's expression softened with hope and uncertainty. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I'd like to have the wedding ceremony we originally planned. Not because we need it legally, but because I want to stand before our community and make promises to you, real promises, based on love rather than necessity." "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." She reached for his hands, feeling the calloused strength that had become so familiar and precious to her. "We started this as a business arrangement, but somewhere along the way, it became something entirely different. It became real. It became love." The kiss that followed was nothing like the careful, public displays of affection they'd performed for Vernon's investigators. This was honest and deep and full of promise for a future they would build together. When they finally separated, Asa rested his forehead against hers, with a smile that transformed his entire face. "So when do you want to have this wedding?" "Next Saturday. Same as we originally planned, but for all the right reasons this time." "And the dress?" "My mother's dress, with all the alterations Mrs. Mackenzie worked so hard to complete. It seems a shame to waste such beautiful craftsmanship." As the sun began to set over Bellflower Bluff, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Loretta of the morning she'd first read her father's will, she found herself thinking about legacy and love, about the difference between what we inherit and what we choose to build. Her father had left her property and money, but more importantly, he'd left her a community worth fighting for and the wisdom to recognize a partner worthy of sharing the struggle. The inheritance had brought challenges and dangers, but it had also brought her Asa man, whose past had prepared him to value the kind of life they could create together. A week later, Loretta Harlan became Loretta Boone for the second time, walking down the church aisle in her mother's dress, while her husband waited at the altar with tears in his eyes. The ceremony was everything. Their proxy marriage hadn't been joyful, public, and witnessed by a community that had learned to appreciate the love story that had grown from practical necessity into something transcendent. As they exchanged rings and spoke vows that came from the heart rather than legal requirement, Loretta realized that her father's greatest gift hadn't been the inheritance itself, but the circumstances that had led her to discover what she truly wanted from life. Sometimes the best things begin with the hardest choices, and sometimes love starts with a contract and ends with a promise whispered beneath prairie stars.